I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and today I'm going to show you another seam finish. This is a slightly fancier one. It's binding the edges of your seam allowances with bias tape. So I have a seam here, and this is sewn with a typical 5/8 inch seam allowance, which is what you would normally find in sewing clothing. I pressed the seam over to one side, which is also typical for clothing. And I have here some bias tape. This is a 1/2 inch double fold bias tape, which means that once you fold it the second time, it's actually 1/4 of an inch. And you can use any size you want, but this makes for a nice thin little strip. You can also trim the seam allowance if you want, but I'm going to leave it wide this time just because I like the way it's going to look. So I'm just working the edge of my seam allowance into the fold of the bias tape. And then I'm going to take it over to the machine and stitch it down. Okay, I have folded what would be the garment pieces back out of the way so that all I've got here going under the needle is the seam allowance. And I'm just going to get it in place, back stitch. I'm stitching as close as I can to the edge of that fold. Let me pull on my threads here. There it goes. And as I work, I'm just going to keep working to make sure when I was getting settled in there, it slipped out of the fold a bit. So just stop every once in a while and check. And you've got it. I always double check and make sure I did catch all the tape on the other side. And if you open it up, oops, now you have a nice clean tape, so there's no raw edges that are going to be irritating. Now you could definitely cut that a lot shorter. It's totally up to you though. You can also leave it wide and use a wider bias tape. I really like to use a contrasting color because I think it looks pretty. I didn't just do that so you guys could see it. I often do that inside garments just because I like the way it looks. This is another version. It's almost identical to what I just did, but this is something that would be typical for using with heavier fabrics. This time I pressed the seam allowance open and I bound each side separately instead of having the one piece that's got both of your flaps of seam allowance. This is typical with heavier fabrics, and you would see it often on the inside of a coat, for example. So that's what I did here with a little bit of corduroy. You could do that with a velvet or a heavy wool, and that makes for a really, really pretty inside to your garment. One thing that I really like about this technique is that you can play with it. Here's another example. This one I'm doing inside out. So I sewed my fabrics together with the wrong sides together. This is the wrong side, this is the right side, this is the outside of the garment. And then I pressed it to one side and I trimmed the seam allowance to be the same width as my bias tape. This is a slightly wider bias tape. So I'm going to tuck that in there so it's all lined up. And now I'm going to take it back to the machine, and instead of sewing it so that I'm just sewing the seam allowance into the binding, which is one possibility, I'm going to open it up and I'm going to lay it flat, and I'm going to basically top stitch down both sides of this, so you'll get a decorative seam on the outside. So you could use this on the outside, the side seams of a skirt or the side seams of a pair of pants. I love using this on a pair of pants. It looks really great. So I'm going to take this over to the machine and stitch that down now so you can see it. Okay, so I've got this tape folded around my seam allowance, and I've got it nice and flat, everything's smooth, everything's lined up, and I'm just going to back stitch. I'm sewing right along that edge, and I'm sewing it right through to the garment piece. And when we're done, I'll show you what the inside of the garment then will look like. So I'm going to pull that out, and now I'm going to sew the other side of the tape down. right along the other folded edge of the tape, back stitch, and then pull that out. And now you can see this will be the outside of the garment, and it's got a really nice flat contrasting seam. And on the inside, this is what it'll look like. You'll just be able to see those 2 rows of stitching, but it'll be nice and smooth and very, very comfortable. I've never seen this actually done anywhere. It's just something I made up when I was playing around with the bias tape. So it doesn't have an official name, but it's similar in many ways to a flat felled seam, which is something that I'm going to teach you in a future video. So that's it. You can play around with a lot of different ways using bias tape to enclose your seam edges. The most basic ways to do it are the first two ways that I showed you. One is using the bias tape to enclose both raw edges at the same time so that you just have one flap on the inside. Another way is with heavier weight fabrics, more typically, where you press your seam allowance open so that you have 2 flaps in there and enclose each of those flaps with bias tape. Or you can play around and have fun with it and get something like the flattened the stripe that'll run down your seam, and you can play around with that and make that go down the outside of your garment if you sew it together kind of inside out first. Play around with it. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. I'll see you next time.